for the California Fish and Wildlife. He's been watching birds since he was 7 years old. And has been a bird enthusiast all these years. He was involved in oil spill response and natural resource damage assessment, seabird restoration, and partnerships with Native communities. He writes regularly for Birding Magazine, so you may have seen him on there. And he recently served on the American Ornithological Society's ad hoc committee on English bird names, which I had a little conversation with him about that. That sounded fun and interesting. And he's the CBC compiler for Rain Shadow Bird Alliance. And he combines his love of birds with a PhD in resource economics to analyze bird data. His article in the December 2022 issue of Birding summarized the recent research on birds and climate change. And he'll present that information plus latest data. And he has a special West Coast bias, and he brings that with him, which I really appreciate. So without further ado, I'm going to let him take over. Thank you so much. Okay, now you're muted.
Okay, thank you, Maricela. Can you hear me?
Well,
Great. Okay, I'm sharing my screen.
great. There you go. Perfect.
So let me know if that has successfully arrived on your.
Yes.
Okay, and it says 2 people entered the waiting room. Okay, I'm not going to worry about that.
No.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me. I love talking about birds and climate change. I've done this talk about 5 or 6 times, but there's been a big gap since the last time I gave this talk. So I was happy to have this assignment as to force me to look up what's going on with the latest data, and of course the fires in Los Angeles, and the fact that I wanted information I wanted to focus on Northern California spurred me to do a little deeper dive into some of the mega fires in California and those effects on birds as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that toward the end. Greetings to Roger Adamson, one of my old Yolo County buddies. And so I'll share a little bit about myself. How do I move this slide here? Here we go. Okay. Okay. So first I was going to say, so I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I do a lot of reading on Cherokee worldviews, and this whole talk is a land acknowledgement. And the fact that you're listening to it is a land acknowledgement. And what we're going to do here is study what's happening to the earth by looking at birds. This is a beautiful quote that I just became aware of today by a Chilean poet, Pablo Neruda. Bird by bird, I've come to know the earth. The picture in the background is Katai Lagoon, walking distance from my house here in Port Townsend, Washington, where I birded this morning. And in the Cherokee cosmology, there's kind of there's the heavens, there's the earth, and then there's under the earth. And a lot of indigenous cosmology, well, a lot of cosmologies, indigenous and from wherever, from Europe as well. What's above the earth belongs to God. What's below the earth belongs to the devil, which is probably the best summary of pollution I've heard. It really fits. Most toxins and pollution comes from under the earth. Bringing things from under the earth to above the earth. And having worked for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in spill prevention and response, and working on Superfund sites, dealing with petroleum releases and acid mine releases, that cosmology really fits really well. And so we're talking about climate change, which is literally taking that which is from under the earth and putting it into the heavens. And in Cherokee cosmology, birds are associated with the heavens, not with the earth. They are our avenues to the creator. Um, so that is my land acknowledgement, is that what we are doing here is a land acknowledgement. Um, and where is somehow I lost my introductory slide. Okay, well, so my introductory slide is gone, but um, I I lived in California. I grew up in Los Angeles. I went to college there. Um, and then I went to graduate school at UC Davis. I lived in Davis for 30 years. Um, we raised our family there. I raised three boys there. I've been birding since I was 7. I also coached soccer for 20 years and was heavily involved in YOLO Audubon Society, which is now YOLO Bird Alliance, for 20 years. I was the compiler of the Poudre Creek Christmas bird count. Um, and then we moved to Port Townsend, Washington. My wife is from Tacoma. We moved to Port Townsend, Washington 4 years ago. I'm now the compiler of the Port Townsend um, Christmas bird count, and I'm the conservation chair up here. So I'm getting to know people and know the issues. And so that's a little bit about me. I did work for California Fish and Wildlife, um, and um, I also have um, I have two I have a blog called the Cottonwood Post, which is on WordPress. But I've kind of moved to Substack right now, which I'm finding to be a really wonderful social media forum with some good writing, and I'm trying to be a participant in that. So you can find me on Substack. You can find me at the Cottonwood Post. And on Facebook, I have a Birds and Climate Change Facebook group, which is called Birds and Climate Change. Um, so moving on, an outline for this talk. So it's kind of three, three categories, but we're gonna spend most of our time on the third one. So I will give a brief history of climate change and birds. I'll talk about predictions, which are kind of outdated now because we're beyond predictions. And then I'll focus on number 3, what are we actually seeing? And there's 4 categories there that I'm gonna spend time on. I'll spend most of the time on northward range shifts because that's the main way that bird watchers participate in documenting what's going on right now in our world. And here's kind of a summary of what's going on in the scientific literature, which I do try and follow as much as I can. It used to be, it was all about predictions and models about the future. There were lots of papers on birds and climate change, and none of them told you what was going on on the ground in real time until just 5 to 8 years ago. It was all predictions and models. But then suddenly, um, there were obvious range shifts and things that we were observing. And the cool thing about that is the papers on range shifts really have used a lot of eBird data and Christmas bird count data, which is collected by you and me. So that's a really cool thing. It's largely been aggregated into species, so they don't really tell you about Anna's hummingbirds or lesser goldfinches specifically. They're all aggregated, and you have to tease these papers apart. But there are some ways now to see what's going on with individual species. And then phenology. So phenology means timing. So it can be seasonal timing, life history timing, migration timing, nesting timing. And there's a ton of research on that. Probably most of the media coverage is on that. I will spend some time on that. And that's about, are birds migrating earlier? Are they laying their eggs earlier? And I'll give you the spoiler alert on that. The answer is yes, but not earlier enough. So let's go on to a brief history of climate change and birds. So here's a bird native to your area, in the the inland Mendocino area, and not so much in Davis, but in winters, a lot of California quail. And they were introduced to Washington. So I have California quail in my backyard now here in Port Townsend, Washington. And even though they're not native here, they're still just as cute. And I have 18 of them that come like a little herd of buffalo every morning to my feeder. So let's talk about CO2 in the atmosphere. When we look outside, tonight here is like that right now. It's a really clear, cold night. And I could see the Pleiades, I could see the Milky Way. And when we look up, we're looking millions of years, light years. We're looking as far as the eye can see is what we see at nighttime. And so when I think this makes it hard for people to understand that we're putting that we're polluting the air, that we're putting carbon emissions, CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, and how that could possibly affect us because the sky is so vast. And in fact, there's a glass lid over the earth, essentially. Our atmosphere is thinner on the earth than the skin on our bodies. And that's a quote from John Valent's book, Fire Weather, which I highly recommend. So how that glass lid around the earth, our atmosphere, the troposphere, is really where CO2 emissions are captured. And it's only 50,000 feet tall, which is 10 miles. Mount Everest goes 29,000 feet. So Mount Everest is already more than halfway up to that glass lid. And it's entirely possible for us to put a lot of pollution into that space because it is only 10 miles up. And so CO2 levels now are 53% higher than they were 200 years ago. So we've raised CO2 levels in our atmosphere from 280 parts per million to 428. That's a 53% increase, which is significant. And by historical standards, it's very significant. So we're going to go back in time a little bit. We're going to go back before the meteor strike that killed the dinosaurs. The Mesozoic was before that time. There's this awesome book, and I actually have this book now, and it is absolutely amazing. You may think that prehistoric birds before the dinosaurs were killed were like giant pterosaurs and pterodactyls and stuff, but a lot of them were about the size of a kinglet with a little forked tail. It's absolutely incredible. And it's incredible that they have found these bones that are from birds the size of a kinglet and that they can figure out, in some cases, what color the birds were. So the bird, the Iberomyssornis, is a prehistoric bird, and then the black-crowned Totira is a current bird that I thought kind of reminded me of it. If you look at this bird book, it's weird because these are birds from like 120 million years ago, and you could actually find modern parallels to each species in that book. It's phenomenal. So let's go back 66 million years. That's when the meteor strike came, and it killed pretty much every animal that's bigger than a bread box. The only thing that survived were small animals that could dig under the leaf litter and ashes for seeds. So the ancestors of ducks and chickens and tinamous, which is kind of like a large quail in the tropics. I have chickens, and they don't seem like they're that smart, but they survived that. So after that, most of the animals were extinct. The ducks and chickens were still alive. The birds kind of re-evolved into all the species we know today. A lot of that evolution took place pretty quickly because the dinosaurs were gone, except for the non-avian dinosaurs. I mean, the non-avian dinosaurs were gone. The avian dinosaurs became birds. Um, and there was this one time period, the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum, which is that spike right there. That was a global warming spike 55 million years ago. We don't know exactly what caused that, but we do know that there were alligators in the Arctic Circle. So this is an artist rendition of the Arctic during the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. And there's giant sloths and there's tropical ferns. And this is the time period that scientists study today because they believe it's our closest analog to what we're experiencing at the moment, is the PETM. And birds did well during the PETM because a lot of birds are tropical. And here we had tropical all the way up to the Arctic Circle. The continents were in roughly the same place they are today. So there was a lot of movement of, uh, of, of birds across the Arctic, from the Americas to Eurasia and back and forth. You may know falcons and hawks and eagles evolved completely independently. Falcons in the Americas, hawks and eagles in Eurasia, and they crossed during the PETM. So now we're going to zoom up to the present. This is roughly, I guess, the last few hundred years. Maybe it's the last 1,000 years. Yeah, it's the last 2,000 years. Global temperature variations over the last 2,022 years. And this is actually dated because we're now at 1.5 C. We've reached the maximum of what the Paris Agreement said we should reach, is 1.5 C as of last year officially. We're averaging a rate of about 1 C change. This is average worldwide temperature, 1 degree Celsius change per 100 years. So I want to compare that with past global warming events, which were also mass extinction events. So there were several of them. 252 million years ago. The MYA is a million years ago. And the most recent one is the big gray horizontal line that kind of goes right across the middle. Paleocene, Eocene thermal maxima, 56 million years ago. It was about, climate change there occurred about 1 degree Celsius per 1,000 years. The temperatures altogether rose 5 degrees Celsius over 5,000 years. And it resulted in mass extinctions of some marine and plant life. Birds, as I said, did really well. Not to say they weren't losers, but the thing is, think about that. 1 degree Celsius per 1,000 years, you would never notice it. And birds and other animals actually evolved through this because it was slow enough. Even though on that one graph I showed you, it was a steep spike, it was slow enough that an animal on the ground wouldn't notice. And if animals went extinct, they wouldn't notice. It would just be like, very slow. Our current rate of increase is, it's probably now about 20 times faster. On average, it's 10 times faster, but it's been somewhat exponential. So our current rate of increase is the red line. So this is faster than any change except for the meteor strike. So the general conclusion is that, how are birds going to do here? Well, they're going to do better than during the meteor strike, when only the chickens and ducks survived. But they're not. But what's happening is far more challenging than what happened during the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. So we have 1.5 C in 124 years right now is where we are. And the shocking thing is last year, 2024, was the highest increase in CO2 emissions ever. So we're not really bending the curve down, which is a little frustrating because certainly Europe, uh, even the US, almost China, um, are bending the curve. Emissions have declined in the US. Emissions have for, I forget, 5, 10 years at least. Emissions have declined in Europe. Um, China is almost curbing their emissions, and India is not. The rest of the world is not. Um, and there were a lot of forest fires last year, especially in South America, that caused a lot of CO2 emissions. So um, we're not yet bending this curve very much. So I just want to just lay out the future here. And I'm not going to sugarcoat this in any way. These are standard graphs. The top one, the purple one, is CO2 emissions. Um, and so this kind of assumes that all CO2 emissions suddenly cease. What would happen? So what would happen is CO2 emissions would immediately start declining. That's the good news. Um, but they would take a long time to completely decline back to where it used to be. Um, and there's no timeline here, but this is probably, I mean, my understanding, the way people talk about it is probably 300 years. So each third is 100 years. So then the second thing is the orange graph is what will happen with our climate, the surface temperatures. So there's a range here. Most people agree that it'll be the bottom of that range, which is good. So once we stop CO2 emissions, temperatures will start to go down immediately, but they will take a long time to go all the way back to where it used to be. Okay. And remember, under the current scenario, even if it follows the best lowest orange path there of lower temperatures, we still have an increase in wildfires. We still have ice melting, glaciers melting, which gets us to the last graph, global sea level rise. Global sea level rise is the thing that has a bit of a lag to it because ice melts slowly. Uh, and ice is continuing to melt. Ice has been melting since the beginning, um, and sea levels will continue to rise, and they'll continue to rise probably at an increasing pace for a while. So that's going to be the thing. Besides affecting all major cities built at sea level, which is quite a lot of them, it will affect anything that lives in a salt marsh and coastline habitat, which is a lot of things. Um, so the and if you're wondering how sea levels can be stopped from rising, we would have to actually cool the earth to stop the ice from melting. We'd have to cool the earth to at least where it was historically, if not even colder, to stop this pattern. No one really talks about that, but I'm just saying. Here's a tide gauge from Savannah, Georgia, which just illustrates that sea level is rising, and it's rising at an increasing rate. Still pretty modest, but it is a curve. If you own property at the water line, you know, at some point, no one will buy it. But I can think of a lot of people who still would. Let's go on to predictions. This is a red-shouldered hawk up near Port Townsend, Washington, which was a big deal. It was a second county record, but they are a bird that is pushing north. So there's some really cool prediction maps. Um, Gary Langham, who was in Sacramento, was behind this study for National Audubon Society. And if you go to the National Audubon Society webpage, you can see these really cool graphs. You have to go to each individual bird and then scroll down and down and down and down. And then these graphs come up. And you can toggle between summer and winter, and between, in the upper left, you see the 1.5 see 2.0 and 3.0 Celsius degree temperature warming scenario. So this is the 1.5 C, which is where we are right now, for yellow warbler in the summer. And so this is a modeled predictive map. It's not necessarily true, but it's what they modeled for yellow warbler. And the red areas on the map is where they're losing their range because it's now too hot. And the blue areas are where they're increasing because the tree line is expanding north. And indeed, there are willows now growing, tall willows growing on the north slope in Alaska. And I would assume that there are yellow warblers there. And you could look at these for every species. They're pretty cool. And again, you could toggle between summer and winter and stuff. So here's house wren. You can see they're predicting house wrens to kind of disappear from the Sacramento Valley. They're actually increasing where we are right now, and they used to not really be present, and now they're arriving. So the West is complicated. Obviously, if you look at this map, you can see the West is more complicated than the East because of all the mountains and everything. And one thing, notice the blue area is house wrens are pushing north into the boreal forest. And that's because of fires. The boreal forest is burning quite a lot, and in the regrowth is prime house wren habitat. And the way we find house wrens up here in Washington is we go to clear cuts that have grown back a little bit, and that's where the house wrens are. So it's the same thing here. So this is a map of the boreal forest, and the brown areas are where they're less green, and the green areas are where they're more green than they used to be. And anyone that has followed fires in Canada, they've had enormous fires in the boreal forest. So now let's talk about what we're actually seeing. This is a Western tanager in my backyard pond when I lived in Davis. They used to be really rare in winter in Davis. In 2021, the year we moved, I think that winter there were at least 7 different Western tanagers overwintering within walking distance of my house, which is amazing. And on the Putah Creek Christmas bird count, they are now pretty regular. I think we see them every year now. And prior to 2010, I think we'd only ever had one on the Christmas bird count. So what are we actually seeing? I'm going to talk about changes in timing. That's the phenology, rapid evolution, northward range shifts, and ecological cascades. So changes in timing has to do with phenological mismatch. So this is the spring leaf index from last spring. It's too early for this spring yet. And red areas mean leaf out has occurred earlier than normal. And the graph is at the bottom. And the red is, the darkest red would be plants are leafing out 20 days early. And generally insects follow that. Birds farther up the food chain don't follow it as quickly. That's pretty amazing that plants and largely insects are basically 2 to 3 weeks earlier now. So the issue here with that is birds need an insane amount of insects to feed young. So this is a chestnut-backed chickadee nest in my backyard in the nest box. And they will need 6,000 caterpillars. These are moth caterpillars, which they only get from native trees. And they will need 6,000 caterpillars to fledge this nest of young. So it's really important that they time it right. There's been a lot of research on this. The poster child for this really is the European pied flycatcher, which nests in Europe. They nest in oaks and they nest in mixed coniferous forests in Scandinavia and oaks in the Netherlands. And if you can imagine the peak caterpillar time during the spring, it's very narrow in the oak forest. It's quite specific. In the mixed coniferous forest, it's a broader peak. So now they migrate north from Africa, where they spend the winter, or maybe Southern Europe, and then they nest during the peak caterpillar season. Well, the caterpillar season has now shifted to the orange lines, so it's shifted again 2 to 3 weeks earlier, and the birds have shifted only about 2 to 3 days earlier. So they are missing the peak in the oaks. They're still getting plenty of caterpillars in the coniferous forest. So there's been up to 90% declines in European pied flycatcher in the oak habitats in the Netherlands, whereas in the birch pine forest in Scandinavia, the pied flycatchers are still doing fine. So there's a lot of concern about parallel situations going on with our warblers in Eastern North America. I'm not aware of any dramatic bad news yet. I think most of them are still kind of in the top mixed coniferous world here as the European pied flycatcher and not facing this yet. But the concern, of course, is there, and it only potentially is going to get worse. What we're finding with these long distance migrants is that they're really hardwired by day length. And they migrate when the day length gets a certain thing, a certain length. And when I lived in Davis, I kind of poo-pooed that, but now living up here in Puget Sound, yeah, we noticed a difference between last week and this week in terms of like now it's light until 5:05 p.m. and last week it was 4:05 p.m. So when you're at these latitudes, you do notice it. Yeah, egg laying is now 1.2 days earlier, which is again pathetic. And you'll see headlines in the news like birds are migrating a day earlier. Well, that's bearing the news. The news is that's not nearly enough. So they're becoming ecologically mismatched. There's a whole ton of studies on this topic. In the Arctic, there's not a lot of research yet on shorebirds, but shorebirds are famous for their migration to the Arctic. Things are really much earlier there. Shorebirds are pretty much the same. North American birds arriving 1 to 6 days earlier. Long distance migrants are less so than short distance migrants. So we're finding the short distance migrants and the non-migrant birds are a little more attuned to what's going on and more adaptable. Broad-tailed hummingbirds arriving 12 days earlier. That's pretty cool. But the key flowers that they like are blooming 24 days earlier. And so there's just story after story like this. They can look at migration across the Gulf of Mexico by the Doppler radar, and the peak time periods of that haven't really changed at all. So now we're going to move on to our next big topic, which is evolution. So as I said, birds did evolve during the PETM when temperatures increased 5 degrees Celsius over 5,000 years. Now it's only been like 100 years. Studies from, and sorry about all the dead birds here, but this is a study. These birds are from window kills in Chicago. And they have this over decades. And so studies from the Chicago window kills, from the Amazon, where they had some long-term banding stations, same in Israel, and then the Powder Milk Nature Reserve in Pennsylvania. All of the studies have showed the same thing. Birds are getting smaller, and the migrants are getting longer winged. Um, and they believe that just has to do with warmer weather, um, and they're compensating for the warmer weather by getting smaller. It's kind of an ecological rule that animals in cold areas are big and animals in hot areas are small. In the Mojave Desert, smaller birds were faring better than the larger ones. And they believe it really did have to do with physiology and heat and access to water. And then when they're getting smaller, they have less muscle mass, so they're making up for it by having longer wings. And all of this is just evolution of like which ones are surviving, and that's creating this pressure toward smaller, longer winged birds within the same species. So that's pretty amazing. I'm dubious that, again, that this is happening fast enough. So now we're going to talk about northward range shifts, which there's a lot to say about this. So California scrub jays moved to Port Townsend the same year I did. So in 2021, they were flagged on eBird as a rare bird, and now literally I hear them every day. There are several pairs in town, and they're spreading throughout the Pacific Northwest. So that's an example of a non-migratory species. So it's these non-migratory species, these short distance migrants, they're the ones that are really in touch with what's happening on the ground here, and they're moving north because they can. Well, some of them can, some of them can't, and we're going to get to that. So on average, bird ranges are shifting north 1 to 3 miles per year, and there's multiple studies on this across the United States and Europe. It really is closely mimicked to climate velocity, which is the rate at which climate is shifting north, which is at pretty much the same rate. There's climate shifts north. It varies depending on topography and mountains and coastlines. And birds, of course, the thing about birds and climate change is every species is a unique situation. As my friend would say, they have a typical uniqueness, which is why they evolved into different species. They each have a different niche. And so they each adapt to climate change at a different rate. They have different obstacles. They have different opportunities and challenges. They have different thresholds, which is really important. Some birds may have a threshold where they can expand north. Other birds may be being pushed up from the south, but they can't really expand north yet. So the south threshold and the north threshold are different from each other, and birds have different specifications. So it is different for each one. So here's the coolest thing in the world that I want to share. If you haven't already experienced them, just a year or two ago, eBirds released their trend maps. So to find these, you don't go to Explore on eBird. You have to go to Science. There's a Science tab. And then, so I've got a bar above this, so I can't see. There it is. eBird, Science, Status, and Trends. And then you can enter in like lesser goldfinch, and then it pops up this beautiful range map, and then you could click on Trend Map. And this is a new feature on eBird just within the last year. The trend maps are this, and they're the coolest thing. They're basically like each dot is roughly a little bit bigger, roughly the size of a Christmas bird count circle. And from all the data that people have entered. And it's a trend from roughly 2012 to the present. So it's only 10 years, and climate change has been happening a lot longer than that. So it's just a snippet. But the blue dots are where birds are increasing, the lesser goldfinch in this example, and the red dot is where they're declining. And the white dot means it's too close to call, they're basically staying the same. The bigger the circle, meaning that means there's more of the birds in that area, and the darker the blue is the more they're increasing, and the darker the red, the more they're decreasing. So there's a lot of information in these dots. And you can actually hover over the dots on your laptop. And let's see. So this is from 2007 to 2019. I think they've updated it since then. And I hovered over one of these little dots up by the word A in Olympia because they're moving into the well, we've got a bunch in Seattle right now this winter. And you can see they've increased 86% over the time period, but they're still pretty rare there. I'm proud to report I recognized the call of a lesser goldfinch and found our first county record here in Port Townsend last year. But I was uniquely positioned to recognize their mournful call. So these are really amazing maps. Here's the Audubon prediction with 1.5C warming, which is exactly where we are with the latest eBird trends map, which is doing pretty well. And you can see this massive expansion of lesser goldfinches into Washington and even Idaho. They're actually breeding in Montana. Missoula, Montana now has breeding lesser goldfinches, and they've been there for several years. They're declining in the South. This is a common pattern. Here's the scrub jay. Those are blue dots up in Washington. California is kind of a mixed bag. Some of that's probably due to fires. The Audubon prediction map is saying that the scrub jays will be gone from the Central Valley at 1.5C. I don't think that's happened yet. So they could be wrong on that lower threshold for them. But we can compare this also with Christmas bird count data. So we had 0 Christmas bird counts, or 0 California scrub jays on Washington state Christmas bird counts in the year 1975. There's a bunch of missing data in there because of the CBC website. But you can see that they've done nothing but increase ever since then. And the great thing about Christmas bird count data is it really goes back before climate change. A lot of the climate change shifts really start in the late 80s, is where you see all these curves beginning, late 80s, early 90s. And so eBird doesn't catch all that, of course, but Christmas bird counts do, breeding bird surveys do. Or just, historical records and books. So here's where scrub jays were in the 1970s. And you could find old bird, I collect old bird books now because I look at the range maps. And they're just so incredibly dated. And you could see how scrub jays have expanded. The little blue dots all around the edge are new records, so you can kind of guess where they might be by 2030. And who would have thought that California scrub jays would collide with Woodhouse's scrub jays from the north? But that looks like is what's going to happen. Here's some other quick examples of the eBird trends maps. Again, pretty well non-migratory birds except for cedar waxwing. And you can see birds tend to be declining in the south, increasing in the north. Chestnut-back chickadees are moving. That's probably upslope movement on the chestnut-back chickadee map, moving up in elevation. Cedar waxwings are a bit of a mixed bag. I think this is the summer. The eBird trends maps only do summer or winter. They don't do both. Cedar waxwings are overwintering further north in much higher numbers now. We had several hundred this year, which was a pretty high count. And this is my old childhood bird book. It was published in 1966. Hold on. If you look at the range maps in there, this whole area that I've highlighted in blue, circled in blue in Buick's Run, that's blank in that bird book. So that's all newly colonized area for Buick's Run. And they're actually marching up into Canada through the Okanagan Valley right now. They're tough little birds. Anna's hummingbird, black phoebe, lesser goldfinch. We had our first black phoebes and lesser goldfinches here last year. Purple finch, of course, occurs all across this area, but you can see they are declining in the south and increasing in the north. And again, the parts of the map here I've outlined in blue are blank in this bird book. So these are all newly colonized areas since that book was published. And I mean, Anna's hummingbirds are very common here right now in Puget Sound. Well, here's the Anna's hummingbird story. And this is, yeah, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon. And the it's not birds per party hours. I just wanted to show you the total number of individuals. On the Port Townsend Christmas bird count in, I think, 2002, we had 0 Anna's hummingbirds, and now we always have over 100. And they're actually increasing in Alaska. They're getting Anna's hummingbirds every year on Christmas bird counts in Alaska, and the graph is much smaller scale, but it is going up and up and up. It is pretty remarkable. There's a lot of talk that this is because of hummingbird feeders, but that and it's true that the feeders help them, but it's really a climate change pattern, which is kind of the force multiplier here on top of everything. The shape of the graph, the way it starts in the early 90s, the way it goes up. I mean, the graph of acres burned in California wildfires looks pretty close to this graph. You could look at graphs of all kinds of biological and oceanographic data, and it looks like this. Here's house wrens on the Poudre Creek Christmas bird count. So they're common in the summer, but they used to be rare in the winter. But now they're really increasing in the winter. Not to ignore the east. Here's just a quick sampling of some of these eBird trend maps from the east. There's kind of interesting untold stories behind each map, I think, like why birds are shifting in certain areas and why they aren't, or why they might be going a little bit more east or west. But there is a general pattern of birds moving, declining in the south part of their range and increasing it in the north. This is a new paper that just came out from Christmas bird count data in the east. And here's all the list of birds shifting north, 1.5 to 4.5 miles per year. So that's roughly the same as climate velocity. And these are mostly non-migratory birds. Not all of them. So of course we live in a mountainous area. So shifting upslope is a way to move to cooler areas. This is a map of change in annual rainfall. So brown means there's less, or snowfall. Brown means there's less snowfall. So if you look at California, you could see these sharp brown outlines to the mountains, and that's because snow levels are rising up the mountains. There was a great, actually, study from the east, the mountains of North Carolina, the Cherokee homeland, and they were looking at the southern Appalachians, and the mountains So this glob here that's yellow or that's orange and red and purple is a map of a mountainous area, and the mountains are highest on the left side of the graph. And this is the proportion of high elevation species. And so in 2013, there were a lot of high elevation species, and by 2023, there were less high elevation species. So the whole map was turning darker. And what they found was these high elevation species. I don't know eastern birds that well, but I guess these are high elevation species. They were declining, and no high elevation species were increasing. And then the low elevation species were like, they were all increasing and moving up the mountains. And this is kind of a cool study because the mountains there are not like the mountains here. They're much smaller. And so, these are pretty subtle differences, but they're detecting these pretty significant changes. I'm not talking about seabirds. That's a whole different talk. It's a whole different world. Seabirds are really unique. A lot of seabirds, the whole population nests on one or two islands, and then they travel across entire oceans to find food. The graphs are ocean surface temperatures, which are absolutely going through the roof. So 2023 and 2024 was pretty shocking to oceanographers on how warm the oceans got. We had a red-footed booby that spent 3 months in Port Townsend last summer. That was very exciting. First one that people could actually go and see. All the booby species have invaded California in the last 10 years. Even Nazca booby, they've all been removed from the review list in California, which is just mind-boggling to me because they're so regular now. This guy became a local celebrity in our town. So if birds are increasing in the Pacific Northwest, they are decreasing in the deserts. And there's a phenomenal series of papers by Beisinger and Iknayan, I'm not quite sure how to say that, from the study sites in the Mojave Desert. And just looking at the graph on the right, everything below the red line or the diagonal line is decreasing, which is everything. And then the ones that are red or blue are statistically significant, and I've labeled some of them. The only increasing species was common raven, which of course are going to take over the world eventually, so that's not a surprise. Everything else was decreasing. And again, they correlated this with body size. This was all adjusted for habitat changes. They only focused on study sites without development. Yeah, it's incredible work that they did. So I think it's really most interesting to think about what birds aren't expanding north. So, and this will get us into fires and the end of my talk soon. So, all these birds are expanding north, but not all of them. And so these are species that should be very familiar to everyone here. And they're really dependent on oaks, maybe chaparral. They're not really moving north that much. There's a little northward movement by oak titmouse and California towhee. Once they get up into the Willamette Valley, I think both of those species would be happy, but they just can't quite get there. We've got wren tits all the way up to Portland, but they cannot cross the Columbia River. That's interesting. They would love it in Washington if they can get here, but they can't. So there's mountains in the way, of course, and then oaks don't fly, and oaks do not spread north like willows do. So that's a real issue. This is an example of where the speed of climate change is going to leave these birds behind. And interestingly, you can see the LNU fire footprint on this eBird map. And I looked at that for a number of species. So this is the Poudre Creek Christmas bird count circle a few years ago. And we had a history of fires. This is our Poudre Creek Christmas bird count circle. It's centered over the town of Winters, just north of Vacaville. Um, and this is between 1967 and 1987, a 20-year period. We had a whole bunch of these modest, little to modest sized fires, a few bigger fires the next 10 years, and the next 6 years, a few small fires, another set of fires, bigger fires here. And then, so in this fire, the rag fire, I'm not sure if you could see my cursor. This was Cold Canyon. And of course, the wren tit lives with fire because the wren tit is a chaparral species. And chaparral is a fire-based ecosystem. And you can see the they burn and the chaparral comes back and the wren tits come back. So here was just our count from Cold Canyon, area 10 on our Christmas bird count. And after that Rag Canyon fire, their wren tits went from 6 to eventually up to 103 through 2019. So that's a typical fire regime. What happened next, though, was a series of fires coming in rapid succession. So on the right, there were 3 fires in 2014, 2016, and 2018. And you can see how the habitat really changed from a lot of chaparral oak woodland to a lot of grass. And this doesn't even count the LNU fire, which then hit the next year. So this fire was bigger than all the previous fires on all the other maps I showed you combined. It burned 60% of our count circle, and then it burned all the way up to Colusa County, and all the way down south of Interstate 80. And it was a hard burn. It burned oak trees. This is what the oak trees look like. The oak trees fell over and then smoldered into white ash. So you could see these white ash skeletons on the black dirt. It was just absolutely, I don't know what the word is, very disturbing. We did see some fire refuges like band-tailed pigeons in Davis, hairy woodpecker, rufous-crowned sparrows at the Sacramento River. Wren tits, I think, expanded a bit onto the valley floor. You can see where wren tits are. This is for the whole count. After the average before the LNU fire was about 99 birds. And since the LNU fire, they've been much depressed because they didn't have another canyon to go to. Like every canyon burned. So these mega fires, I think, pose extra challenges. So here's the Mendocino Complex fire, the August Complex fire, and the LNU Complex fire, which together burned almost 3,000 square miles. And you can see the footprints of these on some of these eBird trend maps for different species. Again, if it's chaparral, it'll come back. But if it's oaks, with the new fire regime, they may not come back. So I'm not that worried about chaparral dependent species, but I am worried about oak dependent species. Which gets us to other birds that can't move anywhere. Birds that are already on the proverbial top rung of the ladder. Ivory gulls are already at the North Pole. Black guillemots are Arctic breeders. Salt marsh sparrows are dependent on salt marshes, and rosy finches are, an alpine bird. So these are the kind of species that cannot go upslope or move farther north than they already are. They're kind of on the last rung of the ladder for them. The final topic is ecological cascades, and I'm going to cover that just with one slide and one story. this undoubtedly is happening everywhere, but it's complicated and it's hard to understand because with climate change, all the parts are moving at once. And it's hard to figure out how they're interacting. So these are the mountains of Arizona. Snow level is rising. And so in the winter, the elk can browse higher up and not be in the snow. And what they're doing is they're denuding the forest and denuding, kind of getting rid of a lot of the understory and causing declines in hermit thrush, green-tailed towhee, and orange-crowned warbler. And the gray-headed juncos, on the other hand, like the understory denuded, and they're increasing. So it's an example of the kinds of habitat changes that are occurring, and then the different ripples through the ecosystem. And a lot of studies are predicting that we'll see a 50% turnover in bird species composition by the year 2100, which means your Merlin bird app or your eBird checklist will, by the year 2100, will have half the birds on it will be the same as today, and half of them will be different. So my take-home messages for my whole talk are: climate change will continue and persist for at least a century, probably many more, at least at some level. Sea level rise may be very significant. It's difficult to say how we will curtail that in the long run, let alone the short run. The rate of change is faster than any previously known climate change. Birds will survive. They have before, but there will be winners and losers. The winners will generally be generalists like scrub jays and resident species and short distance migrants. And the ones that have the biggest challenges are specialists, like ones that are dependent on oaks, which don't move, long distance migrants, birds on the edges, and seabirds are a bit of a special case of a bird on the edge. So I'm going to end with two quotes. Robin Wall Kimmerer, "The land is the real teacher," and Henry David Thoreau, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach." Henry David Thoreau actually took copious notes on the dates of first flowering and first singing of various birds. And people are now comparing his notes to the present to document how much earlier things are happening now. So with that, I will open it up for questions. And
yeah, thank you very much. Wow, it's so sobering.
And I will stop sharing my screen. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I did recommend for people to put their questions in the chat box. Thank you so much, Steve. That's just a lot of information and important.
It's a lot.
It's very important though, really important. So let's see what we have in the chat box here. Okay, so from Roma Lee.
The ravens.
Yes, you see that? Yes.
Oh no. The ravens. Well, so
you want to read that question or say that question just in case?
Sure. She writes, "You mentioned the raven taking over. What does this mean exactly?" Yeah, we need to speak in code here. Now, the ravens are terrifically smart. Ravens used to be a fairly rare bird in a lot of areas. In the Sacramento Valley, they were almost non-existent when I first started living there 30 years ago, and now they're nesting on power towers everywhere. They're fierce nest predators. They're harassing the heck out of the avocets and stilts. And then if you look in on the coast, San Francisco, Santa Cruz, probably Mendocino County. I assume they've on old Christmas bird counts, there would often be like single digits or zero, and now there could be 200 or 300. Um, and they're keen in on human anthropogenic food sources, but they're also causing havoc for endangered species like snowy plover and marbled murrelets. Um, yeah, I think they're gonna outgame us and take over the world is my theory with ravens. So.
They're so intelligent and they're talk about generalist. And
There is a there is a there is a in Victoria, Canada, in the Native Art Museum, there's a modern uh, uh, there's a modern work of art that's the Pacific Northwest art style, you know, with the ovoids and the very stylized animals. So there's actually a raven is the meteor that's hitting the Tyrannosaurus Rex.
yeah, that powerful being that the raven is.
Yeah,
Yeah. So there is a question from Chuck. Let's see. Oh, it just went. Yours got passed up, Chuck. Where is it?
I
Well,
see it.
well, you
Do
said, okay.
more, do more and better birders amplify observed changes? Um, I mean, changes could go either direction. So I would think that that would be data neutral. Certainly we're collecting a lot more data now with eBird and these eBird trends maps. Um, the the eBird trends maps um, are tricky because there's there's like 30% more eBird users every year. So tracking trends when you're getting tons of more data every year is difficult. Um, but I know they do it only using presence absence, and they only use certain checklists. And I saw a presentation on this. They said they only use checklists from experienced, competent observers. And people are like, how do they choose? He says, oh, the computer chooses. The computer knows what you're supposed to be seeing. And so if you report 3 birds, they're not going to use your checklist. But if you repeatedly go to the same place and report 20 or 30 birds, then they're going to use those checklists. And they've got a computer algorithm that does that. Um, but I think the Christmas bird count data is pretty robust. I mean, it can be a little wonky with respect to rare birds and misidentifications, but we're focused on common birds here. So, like, if you want to see what's going on with magpies, I mean, we're pretty confident in our magpie Christmas bird count data. Uh, we don't think there's misidentifications there, and or scrub jays or whatever. And so, um, because we're focused on trends with common species, I think it's pretty good data. Are there similar data from Europe, Asia, and what happens to tropical residents? Oh, these are great questions. Hey, Roger. Um, um, Roger used to be almost a neighbor. Um, yeah, so there's a lot of research in Europe, probably more from Europe than the US, to be honest. I haven't seen a whole lot from Asia. It could be that there is, and it just doesn't make its way into English speaking circles. Um, and tropical residents, I have not seen very much. Um, one would think that the migration issues are not so much an issue there. Yeah, I'm sure there's issues there, but they're I have not seen much. Yes, the Ravens.
Mhm, mhm.
In another comment. Yeah, I've observed ravens below sea level in Death Valley and over 13,000 feet in the Rockies. A superb generalist. It's when they see them with your car keys that you need to be really concerned.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah. Oh. Just
Yeah, there's a lot of research in Europe. Europe and Europe and the US and Canada is where most of the papers I see are, but part of that is I'm only seeing the English speaking papers. So, or the ones that, yeah, get shown here. I mean, there is research. There are some amazing Russian ornithologists, but it just doesn't get translated to us.
mm, pretty important um, to have more global information too. Um, are there any other questions out there? I don't know. I'm not seeing them.
And I should say there are birds moving in South America, moving south. The limpkins, which kind of exploded from Florida up into the Midwest the last few years, they had the same thing going on at kind of the same latitudes in South America, where they went from northern Argentina down to southern Argentina and Chile, just scattered individual birds. The same thing that happened here happened down there.
Well, it was a great talk. Let's see if there's any other. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Lots of thank yous. No questions from you, Kate? What? You're muted. You're muted.
So what I want to hear is like what have you all noticed in the Ukiah area? Because it's a little bit different. I'm really familiar with the Sacramento Valley, but I'm not that familiar with Ukiah. Do you all get tanagers on your Christmas bird counts?
Chuck's gonna answer that. You
Yes,
didn't. Mhm,
Yeah,
we had 8 a few years ago.
mhm.
that seems like a big number.
It is.
Were they juveniles, Chuck?
Well, I don't know because I didn't see any of them. uh, um, the first one that I believe we ever saw that we ever had in the winter and was not on a Christmas bird count was about 1980. And they're fairly regular now. George Gibbs has 3 in his yard.
Mhm.
Wow.
Right now, right?
Yes.
Yeah, he has them right now. Yeah.
Yeah, so the other thing happening in the Davis area, it seems like more and more there's overwintering black-throated gray warblers. Townsend's, there's always been a handful, but now there's reports of like overwintering, like orioles or Cassin's vireos. Just that there's always a few like what I would consider more neotropical migrants spending the winter there. And now in Davis in the summer they have nesting Say's phoebes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so there's Lisa Walker's. Is it my imagination or are Bullock's orioles sticking around in winter more often on the coast?
Yeah, I think when you're on the coast you get more of this kind of overwintering thing. Um, because it's just more temperate. Here we have a massive increase in overwintering yellow-rumped warblers, but they tend to be right along the beach because that's where it's warmest in winter. It's coolest in summer, but in the winter that's the warm. Like tonight, it's going to be in the 20s at my house. I'm a half mile inland, but down at the beach, it'll be the overnight will be 37. It'll be 27 at my house, and that's just a half mile away. But it's kind of it's the same thing in California. If you're on the beach, you got one climate, and if you're a mile inland, it's a whole different thing.
It is, and it can be very different. Here's Matt Franks. I really appreciated your land acknowledgement, Steve. How do you feel that being tuned into those changes, which we birders notice by being tuned into birds, can help us raise climate awareness in unique ways? That's a very good question.
Yeah, I think birders are uniquely poised to observe climate change. I think in general humans are like frogs in a pot, and and no, I mean, so here in Puget Sound, I mean, there were no hummingbirds in Seattle in winter 30 years ago. But if I tell people that, non-birders, they don't believe me. They think I'm nuts. They think, oh no, we've always had hummingbirds. We have hummingbirds year round. We have hummingbirds right now. And I'm like, well, you didn't. Like, we have the Christmas bird count data to tell us you had 0 hummingbirds here in the winter. And just to point these things out to people. But it's amazing. And birders, of course, are more cognizant because we track these things. We notice these things because that's what we do. And you know, I mean, birders notice the seasons more. Birders notice, remember extreme conditions. I mean, birders nerd out on this kind of stuff. And so we are really, you know, we're the frogs that are like aware of like how many bubbles there were and how many bubbles there are now in terms of the boiling pot. So, and that's where I really think birds birds can help teach the public. I mean, we have a great product, right? Because everyone likes birds. Even, I mean, even even some of these crazy political spectrum people, if you ask them if they like birds, they're going to say yes. Everyone, you know, you can ask the most hardened criminal if they like birds. They're going to say yes. Everyone says they like birds. So we have a phenomenal product, right? I mean, birds have more positives than Dolly Parton. So, you know, so it's a great avenue for communicating with people and saying, you know, these birds are here now, you know. Yeah, what's the next question?
Yeah, I was thinking about the fact you were talking about the birds that have the specific needs, like oak titmouse needing oaks, and the idea of really pushing planting oaks wherever they can be planted, because oaks are pretty adaptable also. You know, they
Yeah.
plant oaks, you know,
So it's interesting.
100%.
It's interesting what's happening um, with that is a lot of the uh, natural resource agency people are not going to start planting a non-native species in their area without study. But there's just not time for that, right? I mean, oaks take decades to mature, and you can't do a study and then decide you're going to do it. So California Fish and Wildlife is studying some of this stuff. Meanwhile, I have a friend that works for Department of Parks and Rec as a suburb of Portland, Oregon. They flew down to Arizona and got a bunch of Arizona oaks to plant in their city parks. And I'm like, well, that's how this is going to happen, is like people doing that kind of thing. And if Nuttall's woodpeckers make it up there, they're going to be in that city park.
Yeah.
And I mean, as a birder, I know that, you know, I know these little niche habitats to go to find certain species. And I know that in 30 years, if there's a Nuttall's woodpecker in Portland, it's going to be in those oaks that this guy planted.
Yeah, oaks attract things. They're so incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, so Vishnu says, is there any reason to think that projected impact climate change will have on insects might create a more or less favorable outcome for birds?
That is a great question. One of the most frustrating things I have about the state of ornithology and birding today is, for most birds, we don't know what they eat. We literally don't know what they eat. So suddenly we have an influx of Say's phoebes into the southern Sacramento Valley nesting. I assume they're keying in on a certain food, which is probably a certain insect, but we don't know what. We haven't noticed the insect, and we don't know what they're eating. And so there could be whole things going on in the insect world that we're oblivious to. And of course, it'll affect birds one way or the other. So that to me is just phenomenal, that I think that's the next breakthrough in ornithology is somehow we use some kind of new scientific technique to really figure out what these birds are eating and what especially what insects they're eating and how those insects are changing.
Yeah, and what those insects need, so we can somehow supply that because
Yeah.
it's all
Well,
connected.
and the insects are undoubtedly cued off of vegetation of some kind.
Yeah, yeah. What a,
So I mean, so normally we skip the insect part and we say this bird likes oaks, this bird likes, you know, certain habitat, wetlands. But the truth is they don't, they like the food that's in those habitats.
yeah, yeah.
Are you familiar with the work of Doug Tallamy, Steve?
A little bit. Tell me more.
Mhm.
Well, he has had people across the country setting up cameras and counting and photographing the food that parent birds bring to their babies.
Okay.
It's overwhelmingly caterpillars,
Right, right.
and more
Yeah,
caterpillars than butterfly caterpillars because there are more moths than butterflies.
yeah,
Oaks support more caterpillars and more overall life forms than any other genus, plant genus in North America.
yeah. Yeah, here we don't have oaks, but it's all the chickadees need 6,000 caterpillars, and it's all from the birches, the bitter cherries, and the willows.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I've got all of those around my house, so I'm fortunate. But um, yeah, the the moth caterpillars are critical. But I think when they're not feeding chicks, the adult birds, and when it's outside the caterpillar um, uh, season, they're eating other things. And you know, I mean, we watch Black Phoebe's flycatch, but we don't know what they're catching.
Probably a variety. Yeah.
I can't remember what insect species Doug Tallamy observed in his yard gleaning in the middle of winter. But he discovered that a lot of caterpillars overwinter as caterpillars, looking
Okay.
like twigs. They,
Oh,
yeah, and you can't find them. You can't see them.
right. But the birds find them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the
Yeah. The birds find them. Now I see there's another question, but I can't see the top of it. Can you see it, Steve?
Is there is there any reason to think the projected impact
No,
climate change? Oh,
no,
well, that was the
it's
insect one.
the one before
Oh,
that, where it says it.
oh, what purposes are longer wings serving again? Does it have to do with needing to move longer distances because of changing temps? No, they're moving the same distance, but their bodies have become smaller because of the heat. The hotter the larger birds. Let's just say we're talking about a black-throated blue warbler. The larger black-throated blue warblers don't survive as well as the small black-throated blue warblers because of physiology of heat and stuff. So, but the smaller ones have smaller muscle mass, so they can't migrate as successfully unless their wings are longer. So the successful birds that are evolving are the ones that are smaller but have longer wings to make up for their smaller muscles.
Hmm.
Oh,
well, that's interesting.
yeah.
At least that's the thinking.
So I was really surprised to learn from Dan, and I'm sure he'll be talking about this in the next talk, but about the fact that one of the reasons why purple martins are such late migrators is because they wait for the predatory insects to hatch out, and the predatory insects wait for the other insects to hatch out, right? So they're following
Okay.
dragonflies and things,
Mm-hmm.
other insects, and so there's so many intricacies.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know purple martins here always forage quite high in the sky,
Mm-hmm.
quite high. Um, yeah, I don't know what they're eating.
They're
That's
eating
cool.
dragonflies. They're eating dragonflies.
Wow.
A lot of what they
Wow.
eat. Yeah, if you start watching them feed their
Wow.
young, they have big old dragonflies in their mouth. which is they're big. They're big birds.
So we have a remarkable influx right now here in Puget Sound, all the way up to British Columbia, of barn swallows.
Oh,
Right now, if you look on the eBird map for barn swallows, right now, there's hundreds of records in the last week
wow.
from Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And we're having overnight lows in the 20s. It's like,
What are they
what are
eating?
they eating?
Yeah. Well, we've had overnight lows in the 30s, and today was 25. And I
Okay.
could be out in the valley, which is where I work. It's a small valley in Willits, and there are a lot of insects. It's like there's
Okay.
these little clouds of insects. I don't know what they are,
Okay.
but they are. There are insects out there.
Yeah.
I don't know how they're surviving, but it gets warm during the day. So
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
have the
Say or two.
fluctuation of temperature. So I was
Yeah.
very surprised. And we actually just saw on we had a field trip on Saturday, there were a lot of tree swallows, quite a few tree swallows,
Okay.
not hundreds, but quite like maybe 10, I think. What was it, Chuck? Was it maybe 10 tree swallows? He was there.
5 or 10.
And
Yeah.
10, yeah, 5 to 10. But it was surprising. They were
yeah.
they were eating things.
So Lisa Walker is a Facebook friend who I've never met. My daughter said that until the recent freeze, Orcas Island in the San Juans had tons of mosquitoes. Yeah,
Oh, there you
that
go.
does not surprise me. We have not had a freeze here until this week, and I'm on. I mean, I'm on the Strait of Juan de Fuca. I'm on the Olympic Peninsula, so it's been in the 40s and the 30s, but we hadn't had frost until this week. And there were some. I think there was a bee the other last week. There was a bee, and I'm like, it's January in Washington, but yeah, there were bugs because we hadn't had a freeze. In fact, I have flowers blooming in my yard, which is crazy right now.
But if birds are dependent on day length to migrate,
Yeah,
something else is pushing those birds. Temperature, insects, something
yeah.
would cause those barn swallows to
I
do that.
have to think the barn swallows are following the food. It's kind of been a phenomenon uh, since around 2001, based on I'm talking to some old timers up here that they've had these winter influxes of barn swallows.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Well, it's important for us all to keep our eyes open and pay attention, I think, and think about these things deeply because not things are happening fast.
They are.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Steve.
It was a pleasure meeting you, and greetings to everyone. And maybe I'll see some of you. I still have grandchildren in Davis now. One child and two grandchildren in Davis, so I do come down there.
Well, yes, please look me up. I do work in the Valley and would love to have
Okay.
you out. And I'm sure Peregrine Audubon would love to have you on a field trip or anything. So
Yeah,
just
yeah.
know.
Okay. Take
Yeah.
care.
Thank you so much.